This video is for Chapter 15 of the Criminological Theory, Context, and Consequences textbook. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the biosocial theories and perspectives that are becoming more prevalent in the field of criminology. It's important to recognize that biosocial criminology is not a theory in and of itself, but it's a group of theories, or kind of a perspective, if you will, that encompasses a lot of different ideas. And the primary focus of this area of study is the examination of biosocial risk and protective factors that we talked a little bit about in the last chapter, which are just biological indicators that might make someone more prone to criminal behavior, or protective factors that might make them less prone to criminal behavior. And one of the things we'll talk about towards the end of this chapter here is what some of the theory how these theories affect the policy implications that we deal with in terms of addressing crime through these types of studies. When we look at biological risk factors, we're talking about deficits that someone has that will increase the likelihood that they will become involved in crime. And some of the more sophisticated biosocial approaches that we see today hardly ever make this simple argument that some people are inherently criminal because of some biological factor they possess. There's much more to it than that. And when we look at antisocial behavior, it can usually be traced to more than one biological risk factor. And there may be also environmental risk factors or sociological risk factors that combine with those to create more of a tendency for criminal behavior. Looking at some of the risk factors that this field examines, one is intelligence. And the concept of intelligence sounds simple, but it's actually kind of a complex concept. It's difficult to measure. IQ tests have been shown to be pretty reliable at being some kind of an indicator of people's intelligence. But when we talk about intelligence, we're not just talking about how much you know. There's more to it than that. But when we look at IQ, most of the evidence shows that about 60% of a person's IQ is inherited. So there's a definite biological influence from your parents as to the level of intelligence that any particular person has. Another risk factor is what we call ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. This can be a significant risk factor in terms of antisocial behavior, especially if it's not monitored and kind of brought under control. But again, these kinds of things can be overcome given a positive social environment, but again, it's a risk factor that may make someone more prone to criminal behavior than someone who does not exhibit this particular biological trait. Another risk factor that we look at from a biological standpoint sometimes is alcoholism. Now, one of the things you have to be aware of here is that alcoholism is really a socially defined characteristic. We have come up with ways that we define whether or not someone is a quote alcoholic, but there is no really one standard definition that applies to everybody everywhere. Just our society has come up with how we define it. So there can be a problem in looking at biological markers to predict something that we define kind of in a social way. But that being said, there are some biological indicators that do seem to make people more prone to what we call alcoholism. And alcoholism can be certainly associated with a lot of antisocial behaviors and criminal involvement. On the opposite end of the spectrum from risk factors are what we call protective factors, which again are things that will tend to insulate people from antisocial or criminal behavior. One of the things that we looked at is the ability to show empathy. And a pretty consistent finding is that most serious violent criminals really lack the ability to have empathy for their victims, meaning they just don't understand how their actions negatively affect other people. But it's also been found that empathy is a trait that is largely inherited. It's again kind of like intelligence. A lot of your ability to empathize has to do with your biological makeup. And one of the things that we find is that females generally tend to have a much higher ability to show empathy than males in general. And this may have to do with some of the differences in hormone levels in their bodies compared to males. And that may be a partial explanation for some of the gender differences we see in criminal behavior. Other protective factors might include things like agreeableness, conscientiousness, having a conscience. People who experience what we consider moral emotions, which would be regret, shame, guilt, those kinds of things, they tend to exhibit less criminal behavior because they know that if they do these things, they're going to feel guilty or they'll feel bad about it, and that kind of insulates them from getting involved in that sort of thing. Another major protective factor that we look at in criminology is the concept of self-control, and this is very similar to Gottfredson and Hershey's low self-control theory, if you remember that. But self-control really depends on self-awareness to a large extent. People need to be able to be aware of their surroundings and what they're doing, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and then be able to monitor their behavior accordingly. If you remember from Gottfredson and Hershey's theory, one of the main predictors that they found for low self-control was poor parenting. So conversely, good parenting practices should tend to promote higher levels of self-control. And there's quite a bit of parenting research that's been done that indicates that positive parenting practices do tend to increase the levels of self-control in children, and then that increased level of self-control also acts as an insulation against being involved in a lot of juvenile delinquency and later criminal behavior. Another factor we look at from a biological standpoint is environmental toxins in the environment. And the most common toxins we look at are things like mercury and lead. And people that get large amounts of these contaminants in their system can have all kinds of problems, and it can cause neurological problems. And they'll lead to things like hyperactivity in children, learning disabilities, and IQ deficits. So these environmental toxins are important from a biological perspective because they create biological problems in people that then impact crime. So the toxins themselves may not cause people to commit crime, but they create situations within people's bodies that give them disadvantages that make them more likely to participate in crime. Another common toxin is tobacco smoke. One of the things that's also been well researched is the effects of tobacco and nicotine on unborn fetuses. That can certainly cause some neurological and physical deficits that can also lead to other disorders as children are born and start to mature. And those, again, ADHD and ADD can be associated with high levels of impulsivity, which usually is associated with people becoming more involved in juvenile delinquency and crime as adults. When it comes to these environmental toxins, usually minorities are more likely to live in areas that are closer to hazardous waste sites and have higher levels of these things in the atmosphere. So in a sense, our society is structured in such a way that areas where we dispose of these kinds of toxins just tend to be closer to low-income housing type areas. There have even been many documented incidents where children are essentially the place where they play is contaminated with these kinds of things, and it causes all of these problems that we've talked about. So looking more at the policy implications of these theories, you need to remember that the success or failure of different criminological theories sometimes depends more on the context of the times in which they are developed than upon the research that's done either supporting or not supporting those theories. And a lot of times theories make sense when we hear them, and we'll just assume that they're correct because they make sense. The problem with that is if we don't confirm what we think makes sense with research, then we don't really know if we're right or not. And there have been many instances where researchers thought they were right, and something made sense, and it turned out later that they were wrong. Right now, biological theories are kind of riding a wave of popularity, so we have to be a little bit careful about that. Biological theorizing has been around for a while, but I think I mentioned before that really in the last 6 to 10 years, it has become far more popular and much more accepted to do research in this area than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But one of the things we've had to deal with as this has become more popular is dealing with what the possible policy consequences might be, because again, theories are really of no use unless they tell us how we can change something to improve the world. And so the big question is, what are the policy implications that come out of this biological type of research? Before we can really fully evaluate how this is going to implement in a policy standpoint, there are really 4 things that we need to examine. Assuming that we find a lot of biological factors that we confirm do have some kind of relationship to crime, we need to have some kind of an estimate of how prevalent those biological disorders are. Because if this is something that's maybe confined to 2 to 5% of the population, that makes it a little easier to deal with from a policy standpoint than if, say, 80% of the population has these things. So we need to kind of get some kind of an estimate of how prevalent they are. And then we also need to identify what the causal mechanisms actually are. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, well, you have ADHD, so you're more likely to get involved in crime. Well, but why is the question. What is it about ADHD that makes people more likely to get involved in crime? And one answer has been, well, people with ADHD are more impulsive. They don't think about what they're going to do before they do it as much as other people tend to. So looking at those kind of causal mechanisms can actually help us to focus policies and interventions on what is actually important in terms of changing people's behavior. And that's something that has not fully been done across this range of biological indicators. The other thing that we need to do, which we talked about in the last chapter, is we need to more fully assess how the biological indicators that we've uncovered interact with our sociological environment. And that's really becoming very important, because it's been found already that a lot of people with biological deficiencies can still turn out just fine if they have a positive social environment to develop in. It seems to be when there's a negative social environment that these biological factors come into play the strongest. So that's something that needs to be researched more. And then we also need to determine whether we can actually get improvements in behavior following these large-scale therapeutic interventions that people want to implement. So these are questions that all still need to be answered, and it will have to be answered through careful research and examining these issues. So looking at this a little bit more deeply, there is evidence that biological and social disadvantages may be more prevalent among offender populations than among the general public. But again, the extent of this is not really clear, and we need better estimates of what these numbers might actually be. But the other thing that we need to look at also is, again, how these genetic and biological factors in combination with their social environment actually influence someone's behavior. And this is the issue I mentioned earlier of really getting down to what the causal mechanisms and the core issues are. So we need to, one of the things that is important to examine is when we look at these biological or physiological characteristics, do those characteristics actually cause antisocial behavior, or are they just associated with it? And you might ask, well, what's the difference? It's kind of like the old example of, ice cream sales and crime. Well, you could say, well, crime is higher when ice cream sales go up. But no one would probably argue that the sale of ice cream causes crime to go up. But the reason they're associated is because they both tend to happen in the summer. And so there's this third variable that we didn't account for that causes that association to occur. So we have to look at the same thing with these biological characteristics. Just because they occur together, we can't assume that one causes the other. There may be some third factor that we haven't taken into account that we need to account for before we really make any definitive statements about this. It seems unlikely, at least by most accounts up to now, that only manipulating biological factors is going to produce the desired changes in behavior that we would want. You're still going to have to take into account changes in the social environment, which would include things like counseling and other behavior modification interventions, because it's been shown that both are important, the biological and the sociological. And when we talk about rehabilitation programs, usually the most favorable results are seen with what we call cognitive rehabilitation programs. These are programs that really aim at trying to get people to think differently about the actions that they take and about the attitudes and behaviors that they exhibit. Another thing to consider with these policies and interventions is that some parts of the criminal justice system are better equipped to implement these kinds of things than others are. But a couple of things that have come out of these biosocial theoretical paradigms is one is drug courts. That's again looking at treatment rather than punishment, but also more specifically treatment in the juvenile system. And there are people who are starting to argue that juveniles have a right to treatment just because their developmental pathways are so much different than those of adults. When we look at this argument of juvenile legal responsibility, the core of the argument is that adolescents have a diminished mental capacity as compared to adults because their brains and their cognitive abilities just haven't developed fully yet. So the argument essentially is that because of this, they're less culpable for their actions than adults are, and they have a right for some kind of treatment to help with this behavior problem that they've got. Juveniles tend to act more on emotion than they do on logic and cognitive control. Again, just because their cognitive abilities just have not developed fully yet. There's plenty of research that has shown that, particularly in males develop more slowly than females, but the cognitive ability of males is not really fully developed until about age 23 or so. And this is the part of the brain that assesses risk, weighs consequences versus actions, and the lack of development in that ability at a young age may influence why a lot of males tend to be involved in criminal behavior. As I mentioned earlier, the most effective rehabilitation approaches for adults and juveniles seem to be what we call these cognitive behavioral therapies. And what this really gets down to is what we call the plasticity of the brain, where essentially we can rewire a person's brain to a certain extent, and they have to cooperate with this effort. You can't really do it without their cooperation. But we can change the way people think about things. We can change the way they see themselves, the way they see other people, the processes that they use to make decisions about behaviors they're going to engage in. And we can kind of create just a different pathway for people to think through as they decide what they're going to engage in and what they're not. Cognitive behavioral treatment emphasizes a few key components. One is developing the capacity to identify high-risk situations that usually precede offending behavior. And then we also try to get people to replace criminogenic thoughts with non-criminogenic thoughts. And criminogenic just means something that causes crime. So, a criminogenic thought might be, oh, well, if that guy, says whatever to me, then I'm going to punch him in the face. Well, that would be a criminogenic thought. But if we could get people to replace that with something else that's not quite so violent and destructive, then we can probably short-circuit at least some of their criminal offending. A third consideration in this type of treatment is developing increased levels of self-control. And essentially this is done through teaching people to recognize short and long-term consequences of their behaviors. Because remember, a lot of criminal activity is done because people are too impulsive and they don't think about what they're doing. So if we can improve their decision-making process and problem-solving skills and get them to think more long-term rather than just satisfying a short-term desire, a lot of times that can short-circuit some of this criminal behavior as well. There have been biological influences in the criminal justice system for a very long time. The issue of DNA is something that's been used for a long time to try and solve old cases. Lie detectors or polygraphs are something that have been used for a very long time. Although polygraph results are generally not admissible in court, they are used in other types of endeavors like the hiring of police officers and things like that. One of the things that's interesting is that when we look at all these biological indicators that we've talked about in this course, the ability of these factors to predict criminal behavior is about the same as all of the sociological variables that have been identified over however many decades. So it's not that these biological factors are wildly improving our predictive power. They're about the same, but they are giving us new ways to look at this and new ways to examine policy and how to best help people to move away from lives of crime. And again, it's that interaction of the two, the biological and the sociological, that appears to be becoming more important, and that may prove to drastically increase our ability to predict criminal involvement, rather than looking at either category of variables on their own. It's the interaction of the two that seems to be more important. So looking at the challenges that lie ahead with biological theories, the biggest fear with these theories is that it has always been that it may give some people a justification to suppress particular behaviors or eliminate those people from society that are seen as unfit because of their biological makeup. And I don't think that we've seen anything like that come down the pipeline yet, but you never know when something like that might pop up. Also, one of the problems in trying to predict someone's criminal disposition from genetic markers is that you almost always get too many false positives, because you may identify some trait or characteristic or a gene that you think is linked to criminal behavior. Well, usually not everybody that has that marker becomes a criminal. So it's kind of a false positive, that it's really, again, it speaks more to tendencies or probabilities more so than actual prediction. So that is a problem that we have to grapple with as well. And the other, again, from a policy standpoint and more of a kind of a moral standpoint in society, it's thought that if we go too far in looking for these genetic markers that predict criminal behavior, it might lead to such practices as the abortion of fetuses in large numbers if they carry these markers, because parents are trying to have the quote perfect child. There are a lot of movies that have been made that depict that kind of thing, where you can kind of order up the child you want based on their genetics. Our science hasn't gotten that far yet, but you never know where it might lead. Another challenge with these theories is that biological theories and approaches tend to pull us away from a criminal justice model and more toward what we call a medical model, where in a criminal justice model we see criminal behavior as a violation of society's norms. You made a bad decision, so now we need to punish you. In a medical model, we see the tendency towards criminal behavior as an illness or a disease that needs to be treated. So we move away from punishment and towards treatment. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but you have to really be able to identify what can be treated and what you really can't. And if we start treating all criminal behavior as some kind of an illness, that could really create a lot of problems. One other thing, just in wrapping this up a little bit, one thing to keep in mind as you look at these biological theories, if you go back to the old work of Lombroso and some of his early counterparts, there were some pretty blatant biases and stereotypes that were evident in his work. You go back and they looked at, like, if you have the protruding forehead or other physical characteristics that were kind of stereotypically prehistoric in a way. We're kind of avoiding that now. The work that's being done now is much more sophisticated and is leading down pathways that seem to be pretty profitable as long as we apply them correctly. There are still a couple of challenges that remain as biological theorizing becomes more prominent. One is the risk of a reductionist view, and reductionist just means oversimplified. We can't let ourselves get down the path where we say, oh, well, if someone has this biological marker, then they're a criminal. And I think, by and large, most researchers seem to be avoiding that kind of an approach. But that risk always exists, that we uncover some biological factor in the future that people decide, oh, this is the key, and we adopt this reductionist view of criminal behavior. Another thing we have to worry about with biological theory is, and even though we probably wouldn't really do this on purpose, when we start assembling kind of like this biological profile of an offender, we can actually be socially constructing members of a whole new class of society by identifying criminals in some way based on biology. And so we have to be careful that we don't do that, because again, there is no biological trait that dooms somebody to a life of crime, but there are some traits that are more associated with it. So we can't say that we're creating this whole new class of people. And again, this doesn't usually get done on purpose. It's something that just evolves over time. But that's it for this chapter, so if you have questions about it, get in touch with me, and I'll talk to you soon.